In a heated session of the Senate Immigration Subcommittee, Senator John Cornyn criticized the Biden administration over its handling of unaccompanied migrant children, citing reports of exploitation, poor oversight, and thousands of minors whose whereabouts remain unknown.
Immigration Subcommittee, Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, for calling this hearing today. In response to the letter we wrote on April the 27th, we mentioned in the letter that the first major indication of a problem with regard to what's happening to these children appeared in a Bloomberg story in 2021, which reported a federal law enforcement investigation in which the Health and Human Services had released dozens of these children to the same sponsor, who exploited them for labor in the poultry processing and similar industries. And then next year, Reuters reported that dozens of children had simply disappeared in the Houston area and that the Houston Police Department was struggling to try to locate them. And then earlier this year, the New York Times dropped two major investigative bombshell stories exposing widespread exploitation of unaccompanied children. We're talking about 13, 14, 15-year-old kids forced to work in meatpacking plants and food manufacturing facilities. Worse, the New York Times illustrated that senior Biden administration officials like Secretary of Health and Human Services Xavier Becerra knew about this and continued to move children out of Health and Human Services as fast as possible by loosening vetting requirements for sponsors. Two former officials were also aware of this scandal and that these children were being exploited on a major scale. That includes Labor Secretary Marty Walsh and White House Domestic Policy Advisor Susan Rice. To get to the bottom of this, my colleagues and I on this side requested the chairman to bring these high-level government officials in to get their explanation for what happened. And I'm disappointed that they could not be troubled to appear here today. The truth is they don't care. President Biden does not care about the fate of 300,000 plus unaccompanied children that have been placed with sponsors in the United States since he became president. President Biden and his administration can't tell you where these children are. His administration can't tell you what they are doing, what is being done to them, whether they're being exploited for labor, whether they're being sex trafficked, whether they're being abused or neglected. They simply don't care. Because if they did care, they would do something different. So while I appreciate the appearance of every witness here today, the truth is that nobody here today can shed light on the administration's policies and why they just simply decided to loosen vetting requirements. This is particularly relevant since last week the Office of Refugee Resettlement at Health and Human Services published the results of its self-audit, grading its own papers. And guess what? They gave themselves an A. They said, no problem, everything's all right, and that they had adhered to their own loosened vetting requirements and placement processes for sponsors. But this claim is laughable. It would be laughable if it wasn't so sad, if it didn't make you angry, especially given the reporting in the New York Times, which based on HHS's own data shows a massive increase in reports of abuse and neglect just months after President Biden came into office. This chart, which I believe appeared in the New York Times story, shows that in 2018, the number of calls, reports of trafficking and abuse of migrant children, and you can see for yourself what happened since the time President Biden came into office. Those numbers are skyrocketing. But the truth is, these are just the ones that people called in about or complained about. Where are the other 300,000 children. They can't tell you, and they don't care. Well, taking a step back, the UAC, unaccompanied alien children crisis, is a symptom of a larger problem. Basically, that the Biden administration has, through its policies, fomented a crisis on the border by creating pull factors. They let you know ahead of time, if you make it to the border under certain circumstances, you are going to be welcomed into the interior of the United States, never to be heard from again. Because only 12% of the people who actually show up for an asylum hearing actually qualify. But the transnational criminal organizations, the coyotes, the criminals who profit from this, they know that as long as they can continue to move people across the border into the United States, that the Biden administration will not care, will not take steps to stop it. And we don't know what kind of human misery is being experienced. It ought to make everybody here angry. But it makes me angry that 108,000 Americans died last year of drug overdoses, including 71,000 from synthetic opioids from precursors shipped from China to Mexico and that come across the border. And the cartels know if you flood the border with children, with asylum seekers and others, that Border Patrol will be overwhelmed. And so here comes the drugs, 108,000. And the chairman mentioned DACA, the Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals. These are young people who came as children, who are now adults. And here we are 10 years later. There's not been one single bill marked up here in the Judiciary Committee or moved across the floor that would provide them some stability. And they've been tied up in litigation and are currently in litigation in the Southern District of Texas. So while some people pay lip service to the need to do reforms to fix the problem, nothing is being done. Our friends on the Democratic side happen to control the committees, then the agenda. Senator Schumer decides what bills are introduced in the Senate as a whole and marked up and voted on the floor. We need to do better than this. We must do better than this. We must show that we care about the fate of these children by doing our jobs. And we're not doing it so far.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. I'd like to make a couple points, if I might. The hearing today is an effort to learn more from.
Cornyn began by referencing multiple investigative reports dating back to 2021. He highlighted a Bloomberg story revealing that the Department of Health and Human Services had released dozens of migrant children to the same sponsor, who then forced them into labor at poultry and food processing plants. The following year, Reuters reported that dozens of children had vanished in the Houston area, with local police struggling to track them down. The senator then pointed to two major New York Times investigations published earlier this year, documenting widespread labor exploitation involving 13 to 15-year-old migrants working in factories and meatpacking facilities. According to Cornyn, these reports showed that senior administration officials, including HHS Secretary Xavier Becerra, former Labor Secretary Marty Walsh, and former White House advisor Susan Rice, were aware of the issues yet continued to speed up child releases by loosening sponsor vetting requirements. Cornyn expressed frustration that none of those officials accepted the committee's invitation to testify, saying their absence proved they do not care about the fate of the more than 300,000 unaccompanied minors released into the U.S. since President Biden took office. He accused the administration of being unable to account for the children's safety, whereabouts, or potential exposure to labor trafficking, sexual abuse, or neglect. The senator also criticized a recent self-audit by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which gave itself high marks for its placement procedures. Cornyn called the findings laughable, especially in light of data reported by the New York Times showing a dramatic rise in abuse and trafficking complaints shortly after Biden assumed office. A chart presented during the hearing illustrated a steep increase in reported cases beginning in 2021. Cornyn argued that these reports represent only the known cases, leaving the majority of the children unaccounted for. He went on to connect the crisis to broader border issues, stating that the administration's policies create strong incentives for migrants and smugglers alike. According to Cornyn, criminal organizations exploit these policies by overwhelming Border Patrol with families and children, allowing drug traffickers to move illicit substances across the border. He noted that more than 108,000 Americans died of drug overdoses last year, including over 70,000 from synthetic opioids. Cornyn also criticized Congress for failing to advance legislation, including protections for DACA recipients, despite a decade of debate. He concluded by urging lawmakers to do better and take responsibility for migrant children's safety.